You made it to the Go Commando Show with Fred Galvin. On our new mission, we contend with the naked truths of health, leadership, and overcoming adversity. Now it's time to go commando.
Hello, Commandos. Today I'm here in Washington, D.C. with a very famous writer and author, Diana West. And we are going to talk with her about how she was raised and how she got her start in journalism and why she feels that the national security of the United States is such a critical topic, not just to write on, but to write on right now at this point in American history. Good afternoon, Diana.
Good afternoon, Fred.
It's a pleasure that we can have this interview.
It really is, because usually when we speak, we're many miles apart.
Yes.
Yes.
And could you just tell us a little bit about your upbringing and what led you to being a journalist?
Yes, well, I'd love to. I grew up in Los Angeles, in Hollywood, literally, West Hollywood, Laurel Canyon. And my father, who was actually a veteran of the Normandy invasion during World War II. He arrived on D-Day +2, which might be of interest to your viewers. He was a writer himself and worked in Hollywood and wrote novels, and he was a conservative.
Yes.
And growing up in the 1960s and 70s in Hollywood, he was really alone as a conservative.
I bet.
And so our dinner table was a very interesting education for me, especially when there were guests, and there were lots of arguments about Vietnam and the student movements and all of these things. So I was raised around writing, and I was raised around politics, and I was raised in a very left-wing environment outside my house. Yes.
And I read in your book, but tell me if I'm wrong, your family was in Europe for a short period of time. Is that correct?
Yes. My parents a couple of times had the opportunity to live abroad, and once with me. My older brother went once before I was born. They lived for about a year. And then when I was a little girl, we spent a year in Ireland. And it was really a wonderful experience and very momentous for me, only because it was so different from the American life. And it kind of helped me, I think, see things with a little more distance than I would have had if I stayed straight through.
Yes, I'm sure. Now, those thoughts when you were in Ireland, what specifically was it? Thoughts of safety or a little bit slower pace than living in Los Angeles, or what stood out?
Well, I think a lot of it had to do with we didn't have television or really any media whatsoever. And even though I wouldn't say back in the 1960s and 70s I was really over media, spent too much time with that kind of thing, but even so, there was really very little, and I think it made us pull together more, even as a family. We were always close, but I think there was a closeness in that life. I think that even though I was a reader already, it made me more of a reader. And musically, it was kind of interesting because it was probably a formative year, and I never really liked pop music as much as everyone else. And I kind of musically developed perhaps differently because I was not listening to the top 40 at that point. So those were some cultural differences mostly.
Yes.
And being in the country as opposed to the city.
Right.
Yeah.
In growing up, before becoming an official journalist, who were those influencers in your life that led you to think in a certain way and to develop before you became a journalist?
I think that I always wanted to be a writer, and probably watching my dad.
Yes.
He worked at home, and so very often, well, really every day, 7 days a week, after breakfast, he would go downstairs to his dungeon, his basement office, little room downstairs, and he would write. So it seemed very normal to me to have somebody do such a thing, not go to an office and such, but, I mean, an office outside the house. I guess in terms of drawing me toward journalism per se, I was very aware of the conflict between America and the Soviet Union. My memory of the Vietnam War is more of a child, so it wasn't I do remember a bit about it, but moving through the 70s into the 80s, I was very conscious of the Cold War. And Ronald Reagan was my very first vote when he ran for president in 1980. And I guess just the excitement of the events of the day, the struggle, the conflict drew me into an interest in journalism and covering it.
Yes. Is there any particular individual that you would credit that inspired you to take a stand for the beliefs that you have written about?
I think that evolved over time. I mean, certainly at the back of my mind, I was aware of how it is to be one against many, having watched my father as a conservative in Hollywood. And later on, I guess, as I went to Yale, so it wasn't exactly a conservative hotbed. It wasn't as bad as it is now, but
started
it was
off that way.
Right, exactly, very much so. But it wasn't as politicized as it is now. However, it was still a very left-wing campus. So I was, again, I think when you are in a minority in that sense, you do tend to, your ideas either coalesce or you go along with the flow. And it probably is more a matter of personality and inner spirituality or ideas or upbringing that makes that determination, or it could just be a fluke of nature. I tend to be somewhat stubborn about these things, and I think it isn't so much that I sought to follow the road less traveled or sought to take the point of view that is more difficult to take. It almost just becomes a default position in terms of personality, and again, this idea of you almost have no choice.
Right.
If you are in that way, there really isn't a question. It's not really a decision. It's just a reflex, and it's a very satisfying pursuit, really.
Yes.
And especially when you win a convert or two along the way.
Right. And when was the very first time that you were officially hired as a writer to write?
I worked. Well, I guess I worked. When I was in college, I did a lot of different things, but one of the things I did was I edited we called ourselves a monthly, but really it was 4 times a year, barely, called Yale Political Monthly. And it was one of those magazines that there was some conservative foundation money that tried to help conservatives on campuses. And with a very small budget, I was one of those magazines that got some of this money. And Yale Political Monthly, Dartmouth Review was much more famous and more more assertive. Mine was actually, or the magazine I worked for was actually not really politically conservative. It was sort of a spectrum of views. So it was a bit more of a policy magazine, I guess you could say. And from that, I was able to, my first job was freelancing in Cleveland, Cleveland Magazine, as a matter of fact. But my first real job was to work in New York City at the Public Interest, which was a real quarterly. It was edited by Irving Kristol, who was considered the father of neoconservatism. I am not a neoconservative. I was coming out of college and a conservative, but I certainly enjoyed the benefit of working for Irving Kristol. He was a very brilliant man, and I enjoyed the year or so I worked there as an assistant editor. And from there, I went to the Washington Times as a reporter and came in with Ronald Reagan's second term.
Yes.
And that was really the beginning of my, real journalistic career, as opposed to being an editor. So for that short stint. So that was really the start of being a journalist. And as far as finding out that I had this sort of stubborn streak, that would come out in certain assignments. I would be assigned a story, and the prevailing wisdom would seem to suggest one way, but if I investigated the facts myself and the other way was the valid way, that was going to be the way the story was written. So it was just a matter of sifting facts and trying to find the truth, and that just became, it's a very simple recipe
Yes.
for telling a story.
Right. It seems like over the years, until we're where we're at currently, there's a lot of things that have changed in journalism, and you see whatever channel somebody's watching in America, it is slanted in certain directions. And some information which you hear some things about from people who are directly involved is being filtered, especially on national security. Why? What do you think has led to these different camps, and why some of these facts are not heard and clearly reported in some media?
Well, it goes to the pool of journalists. Most of them come from colleges or even graduate schools sometimes, where the prevailing viewpoint is left-wing, where they have gone through the incubator of really brainwashing in our higher education and lower education too. This is a long process of conditioning that starts in kindergarten. So it's really not very unusual that professionals tend to be liberals or left-wingers or Marxists. So journalism, having at a certain point lost its more blue-collar beginnings. I mean, it used to be much more of a kind of a scrum to join a newspaper. It was when you go back to the 1930s or something like that, you see these characters in the newsrooms, and they certainly usually did not have college degrees, right, and so on. So it was probably a more accurate reflection of how people at the time were thinking and living, and they had not gone through that kind of incubation process by and large. Over time, it became more of a profession.
Yes.
And so generally you're drawing from those kinds of pools of people. So there is that default situation. There is also the herd instinct, which I guess takes place in any organization. It becomes hard for most people to go against the grain, whether it's a newsroom or an army or a company.
Right.
It's difficult.
Yes.
So some of it is not purposeful even. Some people are just simply creatures of their environment.
Right.
And then, of course, there are very hardcore ideologues, activists, also who enter journalism as in other professions, who have political viewpoints. And the partisan nature of journalism may never have been as intense as it is now. Feels that way. It feels that most news organizations could just as easily be a political party, an extension of a political
Right.
party, or a PR firm. There's
Yes.
so much of that. And on the right as well. I mean, I think it's not only on the left, on the right as well, but there are fewer conservative outlets, to be
Yes.
sure.
Has there been any experience that you can describe where you encountered being the subject of almost coercion, to write in a certain way or to describe the facts by an editor's beliefs? Or
Not personally. I've not come under that kind of direct pressure. I would say that where that takes place, where I've experienced that, is simply in what, for want of a better term, I would call blackballing, in the sense of there are viewpoints that are not popular, and so they will not be printed or they will not be sought after. So in the sense that the product doesn't sell more
Right.
than somebody trying to change my product, if
Right.
that makes sense.
it does.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, if you were able to describe how you began to cover national security, and what was it that led you to cover national security? Because at the time when you did that, it was not common for a female who had not been in the military to cover national security.
Right. That's very true. I would say that up until 9/11, I mainly covered culture and politics. I was at the Washington Times editorial page during Bill Clinton impeachment period, And I was on a Clinton impeachment beat on the editorial page and covered quite a lot of that kind of politics. It was quite a decade. And coming up to 9/11, though, I felt that everything changed in terms of my own orientation. And that's not unique. I would say every single American felt that way after 9/11. There was this sudden, urgent need to understand what had happened, who had done this. And I immediately did not feel I was getting the truth from the media, from the people who came forward as experts, who suddenly were telling us what Islam was and was not, who these hijackers were and were not. And I remember I was living in New York, Westchester County at the time of 9/11, and I remember literally going to the local bookstore to get a book on Islam right away. And very fortunately, I picked up two extremely politically incorrect books. In addition to a Quran, I picked up a book by a writer, a very fine writer named Ibn Warraq called Why I'm Not a Muslim. And I picked up a history by a very good historian who died not long after named Paul Fregosi called Jihad in the West. It was kind of a military history of jihad. Ibn Warraq's book, he was raised a Muslim in Pakistan, went through madrasas and so on, and left. He's an apostate. It's not his real name. You can't use his real name. And his was a tremendously good overview of Islam and its effect on Western civilization.
Right.
Those were very important books to read, and this necessarily took me into the realm of military, or maybe not military right away, but national security affairs, because this was the core. And right away, as I was studying and trying to write, and I was working on a column at the time and also editorials, I was very aware of what could be said and not be said. In other words, if you wanted to go on television, if you wanted wider readership and so on, there were certain places you would not go, certainly about Islam. You would have to be an Islamic apologist to be popular in those venues. And the more I studied, the more I realized that was a false way to understand Islam. The apologetics are absurd, and it became very evident very quickly. I very early on met a mutual friend, Dr. Andrew Bostom, who contacted me after one of my initial columns about Islam that I was trying to work through with everyone at the time. This was probably early 2002. And he wrote to me as a reader and just asked if he could send me some books that he had found very helpful. He's a medical doctor, and he also was struggling to understand what was going on. And he sent me some works by a very fine historian named Bat Yor, who explains everything you need to know as a Westerner about the impact of Islamic law and Islamic culture on Jews and Christians.
Right.
And this would be the history of the dhimmi and the culture of dhimmitude, which essentially is the concessions that Jews and Christians make to Islam, even when Islamic law is not the law of the land, but it becomes a way of life, and it becomes a way in which Jews and Christians live suppressed lives. They don't tell the truth about Islam for fear of reprisals. They apologize. I mean, it was everything that was happening to us and has happened since to us was really explained in these books, because what we are experiencing today has been going on for centuries in every culture, every continent that Islam conquers.
Right.
So this became, for me, probably where I really got my writing chops in terms of pushing the envelope. I would say before 9/11, and even what I was doing, I was a conservative, but I wouldn't say I was terribly outside the box.
Yes.
But once you start writing about Islam, honestly, you are outside the box.
Right.
And there's a small group of us to this day. It hasn't really enlarged, and it's certainly under 100, and it's probably more like 24, who labor to just simply speak honestly, incisively, historically, factually about Islam. And it's very difficult. It's gotten harder, not easier. And that's why we've seen our world, our own world, Europe, America, more Islamic than less Islamic, even as our armies are abroad.
Right. Now, that evolution from 9/11, where our country was right after 9/11 very united
Yes.
in having been just attacked, and we knew, okay, these were jihadists, they were very well organized in their attacks, in the attacks in New York and Washington, D.C. That began, as you described, you had an intense study of the facts, and now, as of last month, we are entering the 17th year that we have been at war in Afghanistan. And as you have described very clearly, you took it upon yourself to professionally research and study what this subject is about. You were going, unbiased into this approach.
Right.
And our military leadership is taking a different approach where they don't want to describe who the enemy is, why we're fighting them, and it's often left those of us who've been on the front lines. Many people are confused, what we're doing there, what this is all about. So what would you describe was the change in the pivot from, okay, we were attacked on 9/11 by jihadists, and to the point right now, I don't think our strategy, people can clearly talk about or describe who specifically we're fighting other than people that take up arms.
Right, extremists or evildoers. Well, the fault starts with George W. Bush, who on 9/12/2001 or approximately declared that Islam was a religion of peace. And in that way, he oriented the entire government increasingly across all the agencies and departments to follow that lead. And this included the military, where Islam was not studied, was not assessed as an enemy threat doctrine. And one person whom I've learned a lot about that from is a Army Major Steve Coughlin. I believe he's retired, but I may be wrong, who was early on briefing the Joint Chiefs in an honest, forthright way about Islam. And he was essentially fired, in effect, from that position. It was a tremendous scandal to me and others who were following it, because he was essentially singled out for his truthful discussions about Islam, about jihad as the enemy threat doctrine.
And he didn't have any particular religious hatred or angle. He was just a student, a scholar. Explain what the actual religious documents of Islam state.
Correct, because Islam's religious documents directly inform Islamic way of making war. So this would be of central importance to any commander preparing to send men into the field.
Yes.
But what we discovered, we as Americans discovered, if we were looking, was an absolute blackout on the teachings of Islam itself. I ended up calling it See-No-Islam at a certain point, See-No-Islam doctrine. I would go to various think tanks and lectures around Washington, D.C., starting from early on. Islam was never discussed. And I would sit in the room waiting through Q&A to see would anyone raise a question about jihad, about Islam. It became a game. And I would maybe at the very end ask my own question just to try to get an answer, but I was waiting to see would anyone even bring it up, and invariably it would not be brought up. This was insanity. I mean, it's talk about irresponsibility, negligence, and one of the things that anecdotally began to become clear was that soldiers coming back from the field, once, if they did come to get the real facts, felt tremendous anger at not having been taught the facts, because they had been put themselves and their men in situations that they never would have otherwise if they had known the truth about Islam. But the whole concept of the war on terror, and I'm putting it in quotation marks because terror is a tactic. It is not an enemy.
Right.
Terror itself is not an enemy, but we were not allowed to say the war against Islam, the war on jihad. You were not allowed to talk in those terms. So this became kind of a staple of my own editorials and later columns. It may have become very boring to readers, I don't know, but it was a constant refrain for me to bring Islam into the discussion, because it would be of the utmost importance when you are going into the Islamic world that is ruled by Islamic law, that is conducting Islamic jihad against your troops, and yet your commanders, your military commanders and your civilian commanders are purposefully ignorant of it.
In my experience, a lot of people think that when President Obama was in office, that commanders were being fired. If that, I dispute, because the terminology that was being used was never, specifically referencing anything with Islam, and they started with a global war on terror, which in 2007 actually it was even 2006, while George Bush was the president, it changed to labeling everything as OCO, other contingency operations. So they further, and these are the civilian leadership in charge of the military, and the military not having any pushback whatsoever. Everything is being called, so that who the enemy was is even more nebulous, further distance, and became more confusing. So that started far before the presidency of President Obama.
No, that's a very important point, Fred, because this did start before Obama. It accelerated under Obama. That's important because you even had the Bush administration actually stipulating or prohibiting the words associated with Islamic jihad from being used in government communications. And that was a Bush order, a Bush mandate, probably around 2006, 2007. And it was an incredible capitulation. But you actually had it in 2001, probably September 2001, even with the word crusade. I will never forget that. Right. And I've written quite a bit about just that. The word crusade was used in a press briefing. No, it was used by President Bush himself, where he talked about how this crusade would take a while. And in a press briefing run by then Press Secretary Ari Fleischer, he was castigated by an Arab community, diplomats, liberal media, and so on, who were taking issue with the word crusade because it brought up the historical reference to the Crusades, whereby the Christians and the Muslims were fighting 1,000 years ago. The Muslims won, so I don't know why the Islamic world would be upset about the invocation of crusade. However, it also, in agreeing, the administration agreed not to use the word and apologized for using the word. And to me, that was an incredibly important moment, even though it seems maybe...
Censorship.
Well, it was self-censorship,
right.
And it was also stripping us of our own historical references. We have all kinds of crusades in our history. We have temperance crusades. We have the crusades against disease or illiteracy, or we have President Eisenhower wrote a book called Crusade in Europe that was not anything to do with Islam. It was about the World War II. So the idea that you would capitulate on your language because for fear of offending Islam. This happened also with the very name of the first mission, Operation Enduring Justice. Well, the Bush administration was told by Muslims that only Allah could dispense enduring justice, and therefore they changed the name.
During a deployment in Afghanistan, we'd attend these shuras, and I wasn't in these shuras, but I was sitting outside listening to this, and these are the people that are supposed to be the good guys.
Right.
The people who have wanted supposedly to, have this new form of Western democracy, which just is the worst type of sales tactic. But they would openly refer to Americans and Westerners there as the infidel, not just the occupier, or that they weren't just upset that we were there, but the infidel. And so many people want to talk about that Islam is a religion of peace, but if you read the Quran
Yeah.
and you're very clear of what, when it mentions an infidel and what they are required, to wage war on an infidel,
Right.
people.
And these were the allies you're talking about. These were people supposedly
These are
our
people
allies,
that-
and they're calling you
not
infidels.
just our allies, the people that we were working together with,
Training.
training, giving money, paving
Right.
roads, building schools.
It's insanity.
And
Yeah.
they love that extra money because
Sure.
if you're going to build a school, which they can continue to perpetuate, I mean, they're openly stating that, but at that point, all those commanders had blinders on. So
Right.
one thing I learned in graduate school is they said, if you're a whistleblower, basically if you break ranks with your corporation and
Right.
report something that's unethical or illegal, they said it never bodes well
Right.
with the whistleblower. And that is even more so the case in every case that I saw, including my own, which
Right.
I know you had written about. It does not bode well, and people do not want to, even if it's immoral, unethical, or illegal,
Right.
such as waste. We have spent over $1.8 trillion in the last 16 years on these two wars. That's
just what
nearly-
you can see, too.
Yes, that's
Right.
that's the white dollars, not the
Right.
dark money,
Right.
and that's about 10% of the entire U.S. debt. Which before this war, I mean, in 2000, we were at roughly $5 trillion. That's gone up over 400%.
Yeah.
And now President Trump, this late August or this fall, reinforced,
Yes.
this decision to send more troops, more money, more time in Afghanistan. And I'm not one for saying, hey, I think it's noble that we want to fight and win, but that's not our mindset. We're not there to fight and win. And an assumption of mine is that the Pentagon, they fully understand that there's no way. And we kept trying
Right.
to win with different, troops up to 150,000. All the coalitions just not winning. So the some of these war efforts and how we have gone about prosecuting our own Marines and soldiers, you began to cover some of this
Yes.
in the media. Can you talk a little bit about what led you to covering some of these injustices?
Yes, I think it was probably around 2005, after the Marcus Luttrell SEAL
In
cataclysm in eastern Afghanistan, that got me thinking, as Americans were just so horrified by that, in conjunction with a much lesser known story that was coming out of Iraq at the time, which had to do with a young sergeant named Evan Vela, who was on trial for murder. And he was convicted and sent to Fort Leavenworth for 10 years. And when I was comparing the two cases, which are very different cases, except insofar that in both Iraq and Afghanistan, our men were at risk of their lives due to encountering locals.
Right.
In Afghanistan, obviously, it was the Afghan goat herds who went to the Taliban and brought down the Taliban forces on our men, and led to that terrible day where the rescuers and
Marcus
Luttrell's case, yes. In Iraq, it was a similar situation in that two Iraqis came upon our men hiding, in a stakeout situation, and the concern was that they would blow cover. They were compromised. In the Iraqi case, due to the events, which we could go into, but essentially it was the opposite of what happened in Afghanistan, where almost everyone died because the SEALs decided to let the Afghan locals go and not kill them, not tie them up, anything. Take any action, let them go. And that's what happened there. In Iraq, they did take action, and they killed an Iraqi man who was jeopardizing their cover. And there was a cover-up because there was already this consciousness of the legal jeopardy that essentially saving your life on a battlefield would lead to.
Yes.
And this horrified me. And I was reading more stories about the fears that different, even coalition partners, the British were under terrible stress as well in terms of fear of legal compromise, in terms of staying alive in this difficult urban battlefield in Iraq and other situations in Afghanistan. And I found that this became a way into understanding the politics of the war. The war was not just a military operation. Obviously, you and your comrades could have won this war militarily if that was simply the goal, a military victory. But it was always a political war in the sense that even as men were fighting, people were setting up governments and setting up services and injecting money into the economy before anything was even secure. You even knew who your allies were or any of that very necessary preliminaries to nation building, which is what we were all about. So I began to see the war less as a military subject that I should not write about as someone without a military background, than as an Islamic situation, and I learned quite a bit about Islam by this time, as a political situation. I was watching generals and strategists plot political plans as much as military plans, and I did begin commenting more on the subject, and I found the injustices to soldiers like, and Marines, but such as Sergeant Vela, to be just unspeakable. And I wrote quite a number of columns about a group that became known as the Leavenworth 10.
Yes.
It was not always 10, and it wasn't always Leavenworth, but this idea of usually not high-ranking soldiers or Marines who were being punished essentially for the strategy that their commanders had ordered them to carry out. And they were accused of murder on the battlefield, as if they were cops in Philadelphia who had taken terrible measures and, needed to be investigated. This was invariably, in the cases I looked at, this was invariably not the case. And yet, there's still men in Leavenworth, and this bothered me greatly, particularly after we began releasing thousands of insurgent, Guantanamo Bay, but also in the different camps in Iraq and Afghanistan. Thousands have been repatriated in acts of clemency for years, and yet we still have men in Leavenworth.
Which many they go straight back to fighting us, and we know this.
And we know this, yes. And we do know this, and yet I was very disappointed, terribly disappointed, that President Bush, who's not my favorite by any means, but that he did not give clemency to these men who essentially were fighting his war before he left. And I hope someday President Trump finds out about them. I have a feeling he doesn't even know they're there.
Right. And as you've described, two things, these frontline foot soldiers who are the ones that are actually facing the enemy, they're the ones that are at risk. They are the ones not just at risk by enemy fire or roadside bombs that maim them, kill them, burn them. I mean, the enemy does some very despicable things, defecating on roadside bombs to increase the destructive capability and just the the viral and bacterial infection, and it is very horrible. But our leaders above them that are not, they may be in the war zone, but they are not in the fight.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it became very clear that these cases were political offerings.
And Jack Murtha, Congressman Murtha, initiated one with the Marines
with
from
the Haditha Marines. And it was always about I called them show trials, to appease either our Iraqi allies, quote, or our Afghan allies later on. There were some cases, absolutely staggering cases, whereby it was clear that our leadership was trying to telegraph our appeasement, our prostration, our willingness to punish our own men. And as I understand it, it was one of the Haditha Marines, Sergeant Wuterick, whose case had not resolved, that essentially made it possible for us to withdraw from Iraq because we could not work out an agreement due to that case still going forward. And personally, I was very glad of that, because one thing that also became clear in these wars, and I think it's still the case, and why it's such a terrible tragedy that President Trump has changed his mind about Afghanistan. I don't believe there's anything to win there. There's nothing to win for America.
And our leaders haven't been able to even define what that objective,
Right.
they can't put it down.
Right. They can't put it down. They don't see a need to.
And they want to build nations. And when you talk about these issues, is to include the one that, for the Marine Special Operations Company that I commanded, we were offered up because
Yes,
the Prime Minister,
of course, I'm sitting next to one of these sacrificial lambs. Yes, you were offered up.
Prime Minister
exactly.
Karzai,
Forgive
people
me
were
for
rioting in the streets. And
absolutely.
a simple thing was just
Yes.
remove the friction and put it somewhere else.
Yes.
And then in order to justify that, I mean, we were kicked out before they had just investigated the first 2 vehicles worth of Marines,
Right.
and that's it. And then we leave, and then the investigation somehow over 3 weeks later turns out by that Air Force investigator that, found out his opinion was that civilians were killed. But the fact of the matter is when it was proven in a courtroom later, there has been no, to this day, even with legislation involved, there's no, from the senior military that made those false allegations that took to the press that destroys, nor there's no apology, no punishment, nothing, nor
Right.
is for what I think is more immoral is the over 7,000 lives and over 20,000 casualties and almost coming on $2 trillion in our 17th year. It trying to nation build something that, if there is an ability to win this at the 17-year mark, let's start putting some of these generals or these secretaries of state or secretaries of war, if their daughters or wives could stay at a bed and breakfast over in Bagram, and if you really believe that, and you can
Right.
put some skin in the game,
Right.
but they
Yeah.
don't.
No, they don't.
And there's no reckon. I mean, these
No reckoning.
are millionaires or in some case billionaires making decisions
Right.
for oftentimes the rank and file that comes from mid-America or
Middle
small
America,
towns. And there's really, what's the incentive? So what I have sadly found is the case, and some people laugh at this, but it is indeed a tragedy that what goes on a lot of these bases is people taking over. This is while you're overseas in a war zone. Many, especially in the rear areas where I'm talking about the 10th typewriter troop or the software sections. These guys are taking guys and gals taking college courses, taking Zumba and aerobics classes, meeting their future fiancés, and none of that is evil or criminal, but we don't have the mindset to win because we can't even define the enemy or what the goal is. And America is paying this, but
that's the insanity, because if you define the enemy, you realize that you are also fighting alongside the enemy. And that is the dirty secret of these wars.
Yes.
And when we went through that horrible period where there were so many they called them green on blue, which I found the euphemism, disgusting.
Yes.
The murders by Afghan,
the ones that we were training, to be the Afghan National Army or Afghan National Police. Mm-hmm. We're spending all this money, and they would turn their weapons and killed many friends of mine that are buried inside Arlington had died this way.
Yeah.
And it's one strategy after the next and some military personnel that tout our exit strategies to train these people. They are not true professionals. They sound credible. They may talk tough, but the facts of the matter, and this has become something that I've studied and researched so much. If you read just from this past week about in Afghanistan, so many of the ones that we train are turning their vehicles over that get used to be filled with explosives and ram the front gates and then attacked by jihadists.
Right.
They're not, a terrorist. It's a jihad against the West. And when we can't identify it, and really what it boils down to is the phrase I've came up with is jellyfish leadership. And our leaders, they are more concerned about their promotion, their next assignment, their pension,
Right.
and getting as far up the chain of command. And they will, as you wrote, and I quoted in a polygraph, one of these commanders in the past who stated, "I'm willing to sacrifice the lives of these Marines," and that's okay with the military.
That's okay with the military.
They found him, and they tried to separate me for saying I'm not able to.
You're not able to do that.
I will never needlessly waste an American life, and the American military leadership is endorsed and has promoted and put in a very prominent assignment, while they've taken they sent lawyers to, take action and try to kick me out. And it's happened many times with former Marines who, like Franz Geil, who wanted this, the MRAP armored vehicle that would have saved countless Marines' lives. But they came after him because he was recommending a vehicle that the Army had and the Marines should have had. But, he went against the grain.
He went against the grain. Well, I think one of the worst moments was when the commander of all forces in Afghanistan, his name escapes me at the moment, but there was another spate of these inside the wire murders, and he was willing to excuse it on the basis of the heat, Ramadan fasting, and battlefield tempo.
And they've also I'd like to reinforce those just absurd lies that, because it goes all the way up to the presidency. They'd say it's lack of jobs.
Oh, well, there's always lack of jobs,
and
right?
Then
the terrorists.
I've always heard, too, that these jihadists, the Taliban is tired. This is what they were saying on a combat deployment in 2011. The Taliban really wants to reintegrate, and they want to surrender and quit. And that was 6 years ago. And now, we see that the majority of Afghanistan, I mean, the Taliban is stronger than ever.
That could be, there was a story that broke this week about the hundreds of thousands of documents about Al-Qaeda that came out of the bin Laden raid that Barack Obama was able to hide until very recently. And then what I always was writing about, too, while we're looking at the military, at more of the kinetic war, my big concern was Al-Qaeda in London, and Al-Qaeda in Paris, and Al-Qaeda in New York City. I mean, whatever you want to call them, but the idea of jihad cells and also just Islamization, Sharia, Islamic law, the spread of
Muslim Brotherhood,
the Saudi networks, financing, Iranian. I mean, we are in this age of resurgent Islam, and it's not just a war in Afghanistan or a war in Iraq or something we're not really supposed to know about in Africa or Yemen. These things are happening in the Western world.
But it's almost denied, and people that talk
ignored.
about it,
Yeah.
when it's the frontline foot soldier in Afghanistan, and he says that this isn't working, the leadership almost thinks that this guy needs to be, to use the phrase, like re-educated. He needs to get brainwashed because the higher is willing to accept anything as long as somebody's senior in rank, and has some kind of counterinsurgency manual stating that this is the way to win it. But that is, in fact, on a global scale here in the West, people think that, you shouldn't think that, you shouldn't talk that way. And it's crazy talk that, we are seeing the spread. Just recently, these 4 American Green Berets killed in Niger.
Right.
I mean, the last duty station I was in charge of in Norfolk, Virginia, had the responsibility to recapture and secure vital national naval assets. And when I took over that command in 2012 and really started focusing on Africa, and having deployed and been in Africa before as a U.S. Marine, seeing the widespread, the growth of mosques everywhere. Yeah. But I was preaching, almost telling our Marines there is going to be an attack. Yeah. Vital national naval assets means U.S. embassies and other national assets that aren't always talked about, that we have to go in and secure, which we as I was continually stating this, we did deploy, and our Marines had to testify about changing uniforms 4 times. We deployed on the 12th of September, but there had been numerous requests to reinforce, which, as you stated, the administration at that time in 2012 did not want to, say, hey, we are winning. Right. There's nothing going on in Africa. Right. And indeed, we were almost stretched to our maximum strength because it didn't just happen in Tripoli. Well, we went to Tripoli because Benghazi fell overnight. Right. While we were waiting in Rota, Spain to go in, you had 2 fast platoons ready to immediately respond, with the aircraft. It didn't happen until 4 Americans died. And then this eruption went all across northern and central Africa, as we've seen to this day. It's gone out of control. But, there was this belief that, these are not the drones you're looking for. This is not really going on. And we see it to this day that it truly is. Right. And our leadership is not, they're not able to define who the enemy is or what we're going to do to the enemy. And meanwhile, we're just spending so much money and lives, and we're getting nowhere. Right. And in these past 17 years, what I believe is an even greater threat that we can identify, and we can look at military doctrine, and you see the Chinese, the Russian, Iranian, North Korea, all these countries have developed their militaries. Most of them have nuclear capability. The CIA just came forward this summer as a mutual friend, Dr. Pry, who is a career CIA officer in charge of their nuclear and cyber warfare and electromagnetic pulse, has stated, that it's known now that North Korea isn't going to get, they have a nuclear capability. Yeah. And this is a clear threat. But our military leadership and the civilian leadership has been focused on these areas in the Middle East when, and I'm not either a pacifist or a warmonger, but we have been fixated on things and we have not been using our strategies. But the people that we've been punishing are the ones that, are the frontline foot soldiers.
The foot soldiers, right.
And people have been able to lose wars and lives and trillions of dollars, zero accountability whatsoever.
Right. Zero accountability. And you have to wonder at a certain point if it's all a matter of ignorance or negligence. I mean, at a certain point, there are certain kinds of radical utopians, if you want to call them that, who want to see the world populations change. They want to see there's a whole bureaucracy at the UN, for example, about migration, the Office of Migration and something or other, whereby they are openly advocating, the head of it or former head of it was a man named Peter Sutherland, and I've read things he said about openly advocating for the essential, if you want to call it multiculturalization of Europe, of America, by these third world mass migrations. There are many other people in the EU at the highest levels of the EU Commission, the people who actually have power. They're unelected, unaccountable. They're much more like the Soviet Politburo than most people even realize because they're not accountable at all and they have great powers. They too have this fixation on changing the populations, on not wanting to see a France with French people or a Holland with Dutch people. They want to see these population mixes. They want to see Islam move across previously Christian Europe. And at a certain point, you have to take that reality, because it's nothing fanciful. This is the record.
And it's exactly what's going on.
It's exactly what's going on. And so you have to say, are we looking at just jellyfish? Are we looking at just ignorant people? I think a lot of them are just that very...
Or is it intentional?
Or who are the people who do see this as something good, as something chaotic we have to go through, but then we'll be in this new world. I think there's a lot of that out there, and in our immigration bureaucracies and our refugee resettlement bureaucracies. These were vectors of change that President Trump campaigned against. And common sense, America First ideas about how to protect Americans, how to safeguard our borders, not China's, not Afghanistan's. And, I think he's been really quite overwhelmed and bowled over by his experience in office, by the terrible choices I think he's made in terms of his key personnel. But this is kind of where you see the manifestation of these ideas to change us, to replace us. And you have to wonder, what is the military? How does the military plan fit into it? If we are constantly fixated on far-off places, as we have been since World War II, for sure, we have generally had some kind of far-off war that didn't really have anything to do with our borders or our well-being or our people. You have to wonder about, why is that always the case, that billions, now trillions of dollars, always flowing out to other places? And I think it does go back to the ideas of essentially creating a new deal for the world, a way in which the government, the United States government, doesn't just socialize the American economy, but essentially is part of this creating of a new world. This is where you get talk of the globalists, the global governance, what is the UN really about, how we lose our sovereignty, surely. And this is where the divide seems to have been exposed during this past election, and thank goodness, because I have my problems with how I see certain things Donald Trump has not been able to achieve that he promised he would achieve, including the border wall.
And he's talked a lot about terrorism, but this most recent terrorist attack, it further provides evidence that that gentleman was bringing in, I guess 28 was the word they said, family members. So all these things reinforce not only what he said, but then it also reinforces the fact that, just like with the San Bernardino attack not too long ago, they just accept that, well, the mom that was living in the house, she didn't know anything. She was complete. And we just accept that at face value.
Worse, I think people get used to it. I think that is one of the terrible things since 9/11. I think that Americans have gotten used to these, these cataclysmic events in our towns and cities, the security precautions that we have just to go to a ball game or into a museum or to your airport. I remember I once had the occasion to be at a small lunch, journalist lunch, questioning Janet Napolitano. Was it Janet Napolitano? No. Was it Janet Napolitano, who's Homeland Security under Obama? That's the right name, isn't it?
Janet. It wasn't Janet Reno.
No, okay. It was Janet Napolitano. Janet Reno was the one under Clinton. That was my confusion. I was at this luncheon questioning Janet Napolitano when she was Homeland Security Secretary. And I asked her, she was describing how wonderful it was going to be in this America of the future, where you would be able to walk through the airport and not realize you were going through security, because security becomes so great that it would just, I guess, start beams right off you, and you could just, your eyeballs would be, And she thought that was great. And my question was, do you envision a time when these security measures will no longer be necessary? And it was as if I'd asked, do you think that the sky is made out of marshmallows or something crazy? The answer was no. And it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, that there is no sense of urgency in our leadership to get back to normal, to get back to America, where you don't have to show everything that's in your purse or what cosmetics you're taking on a trip. Your shoes off.
Computer and cameras.
Awful. Horrifying. But people get used to it.
And they can't
that's
say
scary.
anything about it. And actually there's been discussion, this is unconstitutional, that they want to censor it and punish people if there's any discussion against Islam.
Right.
But, around the world, people can, and presidents can defame Judeo-Christian values and talk
Sure.
about it like that's the problem. But there's discussion amongst lawmakers of making any contrarian opinion of, the true meaning of Islam as a crime if you
Right.
speak out against it. And that's not an opinion of mine. That's
No, that was
reality.
happening. No, that was happening in the
happening.
Congress. It certainly has come up time and again at the UN, and we've certainly seen it across Europe. This kind of censorship and self-censor, because what it does is the censorship is not as bad as the self-censorship that it engenders. And it really goes back to even the notion of taking away the word crusade or justice from the lexicon. And then further not being able to use the words to describe jihad or the caliphate and so on, it changes your brain. It changes the way you think. This is something that the communists were well aware of, and it's part of how the whole Marxist dialectic works in terms of identifying people by the terms they use, in terms of creating a reality that is not the reality that's in front of your eyes, but how you express it so that it's something else. This is something that is really part and parcel of conditioning,
Yes.
brainwashing, reinforcing these kinds of behaviors. And, as with carrot and sticks, these things work, people change. It's very dangerous. And the acquiescence and sort of acceptance is really where things become really scary.
Yes. And Diana, we have battled in the United States here within this last 100 years, communism before. And would you say that some of these themes, as far as the immigration and the acceptance of Islam to include all the risks that come with our national security and other issues with countries like North Korea, is that something that we are just discovering, or do you think that that's very intentional, that we are kind of fixating on certain things and completely ignoring
The
others?
deflection, yeah.
Right, and that we're, the silencing of journalists who are, a lot of your arguments are utilizing the doctrine, just like in the military, she's been a very staunch hawk on holding the military accountable because they believe in the hearts and minds, which is just not, it's never been able to be proven
Doesn't
effective.
work, right.
But where do you think this is really, how do we have some of these really horrible failed strategies? Is it accidental, or do you think it's deliberate?
Well, I think it's deliberate in the sense that it's an outgrowth of a lot of these same kinds of one world globalistic teachings that do come out of the entire strategy of global communism. These strategies are very similar, or not similar, but they are of a piece with what we've seen across the past century with communist efforts to subvert, to take a culture with a predominant religion, with teachings, with traditions, with family values, and so on, and twist them, subvert them, make them something different. We see the same kinds of patterns, and we see the same people, the same types of people promoting Islamic apologetics as we would have seen with Marxist apologetics. They're quite similar. They're both collectivist creeds, Marxism and Islam. They both run over the individual. There are no rights of the individual in either creed, or one has a godhead, one does not, but they're very similar. There's only one party in both of their systems, in the sense of an Islamic adherent or Sharia adherent kind of political life. There are just numerous similarities in the doctrines, but I think that in terms of understanding where one starts and one begins, it's difficult. At the same time, what we've been undergoing over the past century in terms of Marxist conditioning, I think has made us very compliant and submissive to the teachings of Islam. Because if we have spent the past 100 years essentially learning not to take pride in our identity, not to stand for our nation, our sovereignty, our borders, our culture, our religion. Right. If we have been essentially conditioned to accept Marxism and collectivization and socialism for so long, for so many generations, then once you see the presentation of Islam, which actually folds in very nicely with all of those sorts of ideas, certainly the self-censorship and certainly the collectivism and the fear of standing up for yourself. These are it's like a checklist for the dhimmi. You see how easy it has been for the West to accept and promote Islam. In fact, my first book, The Death of the Grown-Up, is essentially about that cultural trajectory we were on that made us so ripe for the taking, really, by Islam. And when I was working on that, and in the years after 9/11, that it really struck me that the more difficult war was the cultural war.
Yes.
As people failed to stand up, as people became afraid to speak out. I mean, think about the Danish cartoons of Muhammad. They came out about 2005 in Denmark, and they were printed, if you recall, essentially to establish Denmark as a place that was not under Islamic law. If they wanted to print cartoons of Muhammad, the newspaper was going to print them because they didn't have any issues with that. Well, it started a decade of rioting and murder and mayhem and boycotts and terrible, terrible problems for Denmark and others because no one supported the Danish cartoons. Maybe 5, 6 American institutions even published them. That was one of the great failures of American journalism. And I had cause to go to Denmark and interview some of the principals in that controversy. And I'll never forget, it was so sad. I was talking to this one Danish official who was very pro-American, at least he had been, but he just was saying, I think my biggest disappointment was that the United States of America did not support us. And it's true.
Right.
And that war, if you think about cartoons, the Western world capitulated. You're out fighting the bad guy and risking your lives, while at home, our newspapers were afraid to print a cartoon of Muhammad.
Right.
Think about that.
Right.
It's almost as if there was no homeland that you were fighting for. What is a homeland without freedom of speech? So that war, to me, in many ways, is the harder war just because it's so hard even to alert people to it and then to mobilize civilian troops to it.
Right. So one of the things I wanted to ask is your specific opinion as a woman. Now, Islam is something that a lot of people are encouraging, but there is a lot of support amongst female lawmakers in the United States.
Yeah. And
the Islam, you call what it is, but it is spreading through the United States. Right, wrong, it is growing. We are allowing greater immigration, and their population is really exploding compared to where it was just 20 years ago.
Sure.
But it doesn't necessarily favor in any way the freedoms that we have as Americans, and especially as a woman.
Right.
But there are almost the majority of female lawmakers in our U.S. Congress that seem to fully support that. Why is that the case when, is it because they're too distant from this problem, from their ivory castle, that they'll never, be subject to, issues such as that? But there's areas I see in the Midwest where I work. They look like Eastern Africa, and I'm not embellishing this.
Right.
I'll put up some. I won't put up some photos, but it's just the covering. I mean, it's far beyond what a lot of Americans really understand. What do you?
Well, it's. I think that the ivory castle idea is very valid for all of the elites. I once had occasion to have dinner with a member of European Parliament who sometimes is on Fox News, Daniel Hannan, in Brussels, and I had just been given a tour of Molenbeek, which it became very notorious because the Paris terrorists were hiding out there very happily until they were caught a year or so ago, and other terrorist incidents involving Molenbeek residents. It is an Islamic section of Brussels, and it was like being in North Africa or some other Islamic land to actually travel through it, which I did. And I asked this fellow who lived and worked and was a politician, very involved in Brussels, if he'd ever been there. What do you think of it? He had never heard of it. He knew nothing about it. It was as if, it was separated by this ivory tower and it wasn't affecting him. And we went on from there to disagree about a lot of other things regarding the Islamization of Europe. But I think that is a big problem. It doesn't touch a lot of these privileged people.
Right.
I think there is also tremendous, they've fallen victim to the information war. Islam is a religion of peace. They believe what the lobbyists, what the Arab lobby, the Saudi lobby, whatever, they're subject to that. I think that they also probably are antagonistic toward traditional America themselves. A lot of them are Democrats or leftists. And, it's just a matter of, do you have to wait and see? I mean, can't you open your eyes? Can't you go outside your shell and figure out what's going on where women cannot walk around anymore? It used to be you could send your daughters with a Eurail pass and they could go travel in Europe, and it was a pretty tame, but no longer safe to do that. No, it's a horror. One of my daughters spent a semester in Austria. We thought, Austria, it's probably all right. Salzburg sounds very charming. Sound of Music was filmed there. Right. They had a migrant camp not far, it's set up basically when she arrived. So she was home safe. But, these are new concerns for us. But it is the most misogynistic kind of religion and law. Any easy, simple study will reveal that. And I'm baffled by any sort of female embrace, particularly. But it is a liberty extinguishing movement, Islam. Yes. And, for men and women, for Jews and Christians and others who are not tolerated, other religions. And the other thing about it that I think people don't realize is it's all about destroying what came before Islam. And I didn't realize this. One of the first things I ever wrote about the Taliban was when they blew up the Buddhas of Bamiyan.
Right. And
I didn't know what I was looking at. I don't know who really did at that point. I think it was maybe 2002.
It was early.
Very early. And you look at that, and the dynamite and these ancient carvings in the rock go down. But that wasn't just random. That is something that is done in Islamic conquests where the preceding cultures and civilizations, religions, etc., are eradicated as best they can. And this is why you will see mosques built on the sites of Hindu temples, or in Israel, the temple, yes, all of these things. It's not random. It's part of the conquering strategy. So these, again, going back to one of our original thoughts, this has not been taken into account in terms of seeing allies where there are none, seeing nations to be built where there cannot be in our vision. I mean, it's actually the height of arrogance to imagine that our way of life is going to be embraced by a completely different belief system.
Right.
But if you don't accept that it's different, you can never understand why you're wasting trillions of dollars and men's lives and limbs and everything else. So it's a terrible situation, and it doesn't seem to get better. Got better in the campaign of 2016 in the sense that I think Donald Trump was the first national politician to bring it up even at all. Yes. And he gave one very fine speech in August, I think it was, where he discussed the need to bar Sharia immigration.
Yes.
Muslims who believe in Sharia coming into this country.
Want to establish Sharia as a form of government.
Absolutely. It's religious and legal and political. It's all encompassing. That's why it's different from everything else. If you think that you could retool your immigration system, fix up your borders, and protect your culture, your country, and your people, that is a very inexpensive and easy way to preserve and win.
Right.
You start winning as soon as you take those steps.
Right.
And this is where Donald Trump was such a revolutionary as a candidate, and why the establishment, the swamp, the deep state are so threatened by him and have done so much to neutralize his very dangerous policy ideas, dangerous to their survival, dangerous to their ideas, dangerous to their monopoly.
And Donald Trump has called several in the deep state and swamp out, but one area that he, I believe, is vulnerable is those who he surrounds himself the closest with are, and maybe it's because he spent time in a military academy as a youth, and he has, from where he lived and the way he lived as a son of a millionaire in that type of prominent family in New York City, and then going to a military academy where it is, I'm sure there's some ideals of self-sacrifice and selfless service to our country, and I think he has a lot of sense of honor for the military, but a lot of those people who have moved up into the highest echelons of our military they're the ones in this last going on 17 years now who have perpetuated this hearts and minds, nation building. Let's not identify or even talk about Islam or the enemy or any kind of connection there whatsoever.
Right.
But those are the McMasters and the Mattises.
Right.
Those are his closest, as you see in most photos to this date.
Right.
And those are the people who are advising him on national security matters and who he trusts.
Right.
And
it's crazy.
Yes.
It's a tragedy. We're watching a tragedy.
Yes. And I see in the military, and as in your background, here's a journalist who has talked about, she's stood out, and she's taken a lot of fire for it over the years. And myself, from the journalism in the military fields, when you stand against the grain, but these leaders that people praise, and they have literally when you're a general, you have a public affairs officer who basically is perpetuating your myths and legendary status, and that is it's a machine, much like the communism. I'm not saying the two are the same, but people look at them as champions and heroes, but there's really no dissension in our ranks that you can't really, even say a word, and you don't see people in the military even saying a single thing, but the winning of hearts and minds and nation building has failed.
Absolutely.
And those who have,
counterinsurgency
doctrine, which, Petraeus hijacked from some younger officers when he was at Fort Leavenworth, and the Marine Corps
and Mattis, too.
Had General Mattis down in Quantico, Virginia, as the Marine Corps Combat Development Command commanding general. And they both adopted this and pushed it, and have been very well rewarded.
Yes, for all the losses. Yes.
4 stars. That means you get 100% retirement of your pension and prominent positions, but it's not so good for those that were fighting on the front lines.
No.
As we've seen time and time again. And people have been not just killed by the enemy, which is very unfortunate, but they've been destroyed and imprisoned. I think there was, I have to get the exact number, but I think 7 or 8 people imprisoned from everything, the entire Second World War, which your father fought in, and now look at what's going on, the number of trials. It is a disgrace. Even like in our case, when I submitted a polygraph to the convening authority, which was General Mattis at the time, and they knew for sure, incontrovertible, that there was no civilians killed, but then they turned loose 45 criminal investigators to just hunt Marines down. And so, but getting back to your profession as a journalist, what would be the one thing that you would say to encourage someone who is desiring to be a journalist, knowing that there's a lot of bias and filter in the media, but how would you encourage them to have that courage? as a journalist in today's day and age?
It's very important to believe in your own ideas.
Yes.
And it's very important not to be swayed by the crowd. And I think that's hard for people when when they don't keep their own distance from their craft. And I think that it probably is a personality point. Some people are very comfortable in a crowd or want to join or want to be part of something. And I think that's fine in certain ways, certain areas of journalism. But I think that if you have a desire to really follow the truth where it leads and be controversial and have a bit of a hard time in pursuit of the most satisfying thing, which is the truth, I think that a certain detachment from your peers and from the profession itself or from your daily work is probably essential to either have as part of your toolkit or to cultivate.
Yes.
Not to be too wrapped up in how it's received. And that's very hard, especially for young people raised in social media world where everything is viewed and rated, and it becomes very hard to be independent. And I think a lot of our cultural development in the past several generations has been taking us away from kind of, the idea of the teenager as the loner. That used to be sort of a stereotype. The kid would go out and stare at the moon by himself, but now everyone's got a whole posse, does everything as a group. And so we're different than we used to be. But in order to really pursue the facts and pursue the story, you really have to stay focused on it. And one thing I think is very helpful is just doing your homework and finding not just what was said about the story or the movement or the incident right now, but if it's something that has a history, go back and really read. There's so much you can access on the internet, but there are also actual books too. Yes. And it's just very important to do your homework and not just take the secondary source telling you what you should think.
Yes. And I've noticed in today's day and age, there's not just a bunch of fake news and in smaller news sources, but there's a lot of misinformation and distortion of the true facts in mainstream media.
Right.
Why do you think that is?
Well, a lot of it is driven by sensationalism, clicks, traffic. It seems like some stories develop a certain way almost to distract you from what's really going on. I mean, they're just, all of a sudden we were talking about Harvey Weinstein and nothing else for weeks, right? Which isn't to say it's not a story or it doesn't have relevance in some ways, maybe important ways, but there is a sense in which things become very distorted very quickly.
Yes.
And that always makes me think, well, what's really going on, and what are the stories that are not being covered at the moment?
And one thing I've seen is, especially with the explosion of social media, is people can pay for ads, which just generates, this, explosion out there onto Facebook, Twitter, on, whether it's candidate more or whether it's, impeach President Trump. I mean, there's so many stories that if you get money behind it and pay for advertising, it's so individuals can actually take their own ideas. It doesn't have to be right or true. There doesn't have to be any facts. I mean, if you want to impeach a president, and you don't need any facts, you can just get a lot of people to sign up to it. But there's not the requirement for facts. But that is, I've seen just growing so fast with the advent of how not just President Obama was using social media, but President Trump, and people are able to utilize not just social media, but the paid advertising. So if you get money behind things and petitions, you can really threaten and cause somebody to back down, right or wrong. You don't really necessarily need the facts sometimes.
Well, that's very true. And then also the kind of the psychological profiling that Google and Facebook and so on are doing in terms of figuring out how to present, what not to present. The Google search engines and so on are very notorious for not allowing certain certain news sites or certain subjects to rise up in when you search, things like that. No, it's very difficult. We are very subject to these kinds of forces. At the same time, there is, if you're looking and you learn how to look, you can find a wealth of information, and you have more opportunities at the same time. But it does take a certain discipline. It does take a certain kind of knowledge and just practice of how to sift and how to find good sites, good sources. That takes time. That should probably be, a course in journalism school or college or high school, in terms of how to sift sources, because we are very easily manipulated. But yeah, it's a hard atmosphere, and it's harder and harder.
Yes. Because there's so much more. I imagine in journalism, you talk about sifting, you're like a miner out there, and there's so much information, way more than it was previously.
I guess there is. Yeah, I think they had a lot of the same problems, especially when ideological activists entered into the profession. I've read some interesting memoirs of people who talk literally about how to sift. There was a very famous correspondent named Eugene Lyons who went to the Soviet Union as a Moscow bureau chief in the late 20s and 30s, and he was very pro-Soviet. At a certain point, he changes, and he talks about mentally sifting the facts that he's looking at in order to present a happy view of what was going on. So that's kind of another issue, I guess. But news is very easily manipulated, always has been, and history is very easily manipulated, always has been, and authorities, professors, politicians, conventional wisdom, very often completely wrong, completely unbelievable, but by dint of repetition, by dint of controlling the media, whether it's limited books, paper, or now exploding on the internet and things, it's kind of the same problem. Who controls the narrative? Whose voice is loudest? The venues are changing, but the problem, I think, is still there. The possibility for manipulation comes in, I think, with the whole advent of mass media early in the 20th century. Before that, it's probably a whole different situation entirely, and then we can go back to the printing press. But once you actually have radio and then television and control with the image, and dictators and totalitarians and all these things, the citizen is in trouble and has to really be educated.
Yes.
Yeah.
I know in the military there's commands now. It didn't used to be so long ago, but they're called information operations. And I've seen this actually in place overseas, and I've seen it manipulated, with what the military wants to get out now, information operational wise, but it's not supposed to be used against the American people.
Right.
Where you're basically distorting the truth.
Right.
And presenting something, it's meant to be spin. That's what in the civilian world we call
spin. And I think it may have been, remember once upon a time when a politician was in a scandal, he would say, no comment. Yeah. That's something I remember as a little girl from the Nixon administration. I remember just men in suits saying, no comment. And then when you get up to the Clinton administration, for sure, you see the development of the whole spin. Let's move on. We've been over this before, when they haven't been over anything at all. That kind of just brazenness. Becomes, I'm sorry?
Or launch some Tomahawk missiles.
Or launch, right.
Diversion.
Exactly. Diversion. I think that's a time-old tactic, too. But the idea of just brazenly lying, brazenly taking control of a narrative that is false, isn't brand new, but it has never been so prevalent. And I actually, in American Betrayal, my second book, I actually decided that maybe the beginning of that brazen lying to cameras goes back to the trial or the testimonies of Alger Hiss, the Soviet agent who was very high in the State Department throughout the 1930s and 40s and was finally unmasked by Whittaker Chambers, an ex-communist. And it was a very sensational case. But when he's testifying under oath in Congress and lying, saying all kinds of things like, I never met Midwicker Chambers, which was completely not true. Things like that. It was so shocking to people who knew Whittaker Chambers' story that the congressman actually called him up after the testimony of his to say, are you sure this is the guy? And it was because I think at that point, there had not been many situations in American public life where there was a figure of great stature, a senior State Department official, lying like that.
Yes. Actually, Diana, in my case, when we had a senior Army general talking to the Washington Post, and you had an Army colonel from the battlefield having a press conference.
Lying.
I remember when we returned back, were kicked out of country, it sounded, I mean, they sound so polished. One who's serving over in Afghanistan right now, he was a speechwriter. And yes, I would never put that down, but it's just sad that we have that as a profession in the military, although it's obvious that, people do that. But these people are very talented and skilled. They spend a lot of time, trying to sway people. And it was very effective because even myself, it made me, once we landed and heard these generals slandering us and the character assassination, it made me think that if I wasn't there in that ambush myself, I would 100%. And I saw so many people in our command, they abandoned us unless they were on that patrol because they thought that, we murdered civilians. Because it is so powerful, and it doesn't, and people can stare in front of a camera and lie, and
it's
then
a sickness.
And when they're caught, they've been promoted. Right. They'll get rewarded in so many other ways. But right now, we really truly are, as in this case, the commander of all forces in Afghanistan is, promoted 4 times, put in charge of all the forces, and requesting more forces and money to go in a direction which I know we'll never win. And history will tell that tale. I wish it wasn't the case, but when you have commanders that have no goals, strategy, there's no road to victory. It's pointless. So.
Yeah, it's horrifying. Yes. I mean, and you've experienced it so personally, but it's so prevalent, and it almost seems like our leadership, in civilian and military, is just filled with people who are brazen liars.
Yes, they have no soul to
right,
hold
and
them accountable.
I think it is a psychological illness.
Yes,
personally,
yes.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, and you just mentioned your other book, American Betrayal, and you've given me the copy which I read to understand a little bit about you. The Death of a Grown-Up. What inspired you to write the book, Death of a Grown-Up?
Well, part of it was having children and starting to encounter how society helps you and raise your child in the sense of watching the child develop and go to school and enter into different kinds of social situations. And one thing I noticed in the sandbox, which I found very strange, was literally a sign instructing children not to throw sand that was written as if it was scrawled by someone who couldn't write. It was like a printed sign. It was supposed to look like a cute child sign. And I remember thinking how strange that was, because it was a rule, and yet it was almost as if they were afraid to make it a rule, and they wanted to make it more child-friendly, as if the children could read it anyway. I mean, the whole thing was crazy. And then the second thing that got me thinking was literally we have twin daughters, at their first birthday party, where they had no friends. It was our friends. We hadn't seen them for a year because we had twins. And my husband's boss was at the party, and I was introducing a little child to shake hands or smile or something. And he said, "Oh, don't call me Mr. Smith, call me Bob." And I remember thinking, that is so odd. There's something so odd about trying to shrink down the difference between a toddler and someone who's married, had a mortgage, business, all these things. So those were some little items that kind of got me thinking about how society was inculcating this idea of youth, always youth. And then that didn't seem very important to me after 9/11. But, and we alluded to it a little earlier, when I started realizing that the infantilization of our culture, which is largely what I was trying to document, the emphasis on youth and the fear of growing up, the fear, the bad rap that all the virtues now had, wisdom, forbearance, discipline, etc. Now we're considered uncool, etc. Those kinds of things, I realized all these changes, especially going to things like identity and borders and personal borders, morality, nation borders, they all worked in with what was going on in terms of our conflict with Islam. And
Yes.
we talked about that a little bit in terms of the dhimmi in Islam is very much like the infantile adult in the Western culture.
Yes.
So that, to me, gave me real reason to pursue the book. And so the book describes how our culture essentially makes us very ripe targets for Islamization.
Yes.
So,
Well, thank you very much, Diana.
Oh, you're welcome.
I really appreciate you being able to have this interview, and I know the
it was a
readers
pleasure.
the listeners and the viewers can go to the website at thegocommandoshow.com and purchase her books right there. I'll make those available, and so you can get them for yourself, read them, or give them as a gift. They're very, very good, and I appreciate
Thank you.
providing a copy of those to me previously. Thank you very much, and enjoy reading Diana's books, and look forward to speaking with you again on another show.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Likewise.
Yes.
To all my fellow grunts out there who in your youth felt it was your duty to protect us, I salute you. And thanks to the listeners of the Go Commando Show who labor on the farm, who are sweating on the construction site, putting forth your very best at the office, you are making a difference. Support the Go Commando Show in our pursuit of bringing you the highest quality professionals. Infiltrate the website at gocommandoshow.com, where you can view all of the podcasts and arm your team with incredible deals on health supplements, commando clothing, and equipment. Every time that you get a good deal, it supports the show. What deals? When you purchase anything from the website, Amazon, healthcare supplements, you're covering our six. And to the ladies on the team, when you outfit yourself in the super sexy threads from Naked Zebra, and yes, I'm talking about in a fuego, you are firing the sniper shot for our commandos. How else can you support? It's simple. You smash the follow and subscribe buttons on our social media. That is how you support us bringing great guests to talk about serious subjects, not the mainstream media's fake news. So thank you, and until our next show, stay in the attack and go commando.